So last week, Pastor Allen started talking and started this new series that we're moving into called The Angle, Jesus stories. So Jesus stories are those stories that Jesus told to speak to a crowd and to speak a certain truth into their lives. And the angle is that there was always an angle that Jesus was talking from. There was always a point he was trying to communicate. And Jesus' crowds weren't usually easy crowds to talk to. If you've ever done any public speaking or even been to events where there's public speaking, a lot of times there's a theme. It might be your business is putting on a seminar and it's related to this topic. So the speaker knows when they walk in the room, they're to prepare this topic and they're talking to a crowd of business people. So they want to talk in ways that relate to business people. You might be a student and you've been to or spoken at some sort of an all-school assembly or a youth event of some sorts. Well, in that case, the speaker knows they need to speak to a crowd of youth and young adults and speak to that perspective. Jesus had such an interesting ministry because his ministry didn't go and set up in the local community center, the Jerusalem community center. He didn't walk in there and set up camp and say, I'll be speaking at this time on this topic, please join me if you're interested in hearing more. No, Jesus walked the countryside and the crowds would follow him. And they would come to him and say, Teacher, teach us. You have so much wisdom to offer. You are doing so many miracles. We want to know what it is you're teaching about. So Jesus' crowds tended to be extremely diverse. He couldn't just pick one group of people to talk to. He had to talk to everybody in one setting. In this particular case that we started reading last week in Luke 15, we find Jesus actually speaking to a crowd that is described as sinners, tax collectors, Pharisees, and scribes. So in essence, this is the sinners and the church people, the sinners and the saints, the best and the worst. And now Jesus begins to teach. He's teaching from a parable because it's the way that he can teach all of them a lesson that they'll get something out of it. I like to tell stories because stories grab our attention. They connect not just to our head, but to our heart. I think that's why Jesus spoke in those kinds of terms. I'm a big basketball fan. I love the NBA. The season's going to start up here not too long, and I'm excited for that. But the best player in history, most would argue, is Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan played for the Chicago Bulls for most of his career, and many accolades are attributed to his name. 6-time champion. I think he's a 6-time MVP. All of these records or achievements that are attached to his name. But his highest scoring game ever, he scored 69 points in one game. He described after the game as a moment where the basket didn't look like a basket, but it looked like a garbage can. It was so wide. Everything he threw up went straight through the net, just basket after basket after basket. 69 points in one game. It gets to the point where the game is out of reach for the opponents, so the coach pulls out the starters. Jordan and his teammates sit on the bench while they put the bench players in for garbage time. They're just finishing out the game now, just letting the clock run off. A little used player at the time named Stacey King steps up to the free throw line in the closing seconds, hits 2 free throws. The buzzer sounds, game's over. The media starts rushing to Jordan, but then they start going to the other players around him. And they say, what is it you'll remember about this game? This historic achievement of potentially the greatest player in the history of basketball. What is it you'll remember? Stacey King, the player who had made 2 free throws, scored 2 points on that night, says, this is a big night indeed. And I think what it'll go down in history as the night that Michael Jordan and Stacey King combined for 71 points. Every story has an angle, right? You tell it with the idea of communicating a certain message. That's what Jesus is doing in Luke 15. He's trying to communicate a specific message to a very, very diverse group of people. And his message comes back to what we talked about last week. This was Jesus' message throughout his ministry. Luke 19:10, for the Son of Man, that means Jesus was the Son of Man, came to seek and to save the lost. His whole point, his whole purpose in coming was to seek and to save the lost. It's so fitting for what we've been talking about last week and now this week in Luke 15, because what we've been talking about so far is the lost being found. We've been talking about a celebration of that whole idea. Luke 15 starts with the parable of the lost sheep. The lost sheep wanders off. It doesn't know any better. It wanders off away from the rest of the flock, away from the 99, and now it's off on its own, and the shepherd goes and finds it. And the shepherd celebrates. He's found the lost sheep. Then we see the parable of the lost coin after that. The coin is lost. It's out of circulation. It has no value because it's not in its right place at this point. But it's found, and we celebrate. Which brings us to part 3 of this three-part story in Luke 15. The parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. Sometimes we'll hear it called both. Verse 11, it starts. Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. 'Give me mine. I'm due this. It's my right. Give it to me. Give me mine.' Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living." You ever been here? He squandered his property. He blew it. He had something given to him, and he completely blew it. And that first little phrase jumped out at me in verse 13. Not many days later. How many of our mistakes, how many of our screw-ups in life happen in those not many days later? You know, I probably should have slowed down and thought this decision through more, but man, it seemed like a good idea, and I had to jump on this. These opportunities don't come around every day. I had to jump on it. And not many days later, he took off and he wasted everything. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. Think of the prodigal's situation here. First of all, prodigal son, this is one of those terms that we hear in church. We don't tend to hear about a prodigal anywhere else unless they're referring to this story. Prodigal simply means wasteful. So really what the prodigal son is referring to is the wasteful son. He'd been given a gift, he'd been given an inheritance, and he blew it. He lost it all. And think of his situation here. He had gone off, he'd been given this inheritance, must have been a great deal of money. He goes off, he blows it all. Now he's working with pigs, which to me sounds gross. To a Jewish boy was the lowest of the low. He's working with them. These are unclean animals. They're not even fit for eating. So many of you know I went to Israel last summer, not this, a year ago. I went to Israel. And I got to tell you, one of the hardest things for me while I was there, you want to know what it was? No bacon. So you want to know what literally I had when I went to the airport in Tel Aviv to fly out? And oddly enough, Tel Aviv had this. No, this is New York. Never mind, New York in the airport. You want to know what I had? A bacon cheeseburger. Oh, that was good food. Now, that would be wrong on so many levels in the Jewish world, but I'm, just put that out there. But he was now not only working in this unclean environment, but he started looking around at what the pigs were eating and going, do you think the owner would mind if I just pulled up a chair to the trough? I don't even need a spoon. I'll just scoop it in. He had fallen to such a depth that he'd done that. He had wasted his inheritance. Now think about what an inheritance is. An inheritance isn't something that I can earn. Now, you might have a spiteful relative that will write you out of the inheritance if you don't do a certain thing. But generally, an inheritance, it is strictly the decision of the person with the wealth, with the inheritance. And they get to make that decision. It's a gift. It's given to you. How many of us waste the things that are given to us? We waste the things that are given to us because we don't understand the value of them. I want you to picture in your mind for just a minute your first car. So you're 15, 16, 17 years old. You get your first car. And probably, some gremlins out there, some interesting cars. Mine was a white 1988 GMC S15 pickup truck. I needed a pickup truck because I'm a drummer, and you got to have something to haul drums from house to house when you're playing, jamming with your friends and stuff. So I had a truck. It was a nice truck. I liked that truck. But I think I can count on one hand how many times I washed that truck in the probably 5 years that I owned it, probably 4 years that I owned it. The rain did that for me. It was really convenient. The rain would just rinse the dirt off, and I was good. I was good to go. Now picture in your head with me the first car that you bought, the first one that you paid for. For me, my first car was my parents bought for me. So if yours was the same way, picture in your mind the first car that you paid for. Got it? Mine was a 1995 Chevy Blazer. I had gotten a job in my early 20s, was making good enough money to where I could do a car payment. I bought that car. My monthly payments were $329.56. I know that to the penny because I wrote that check so many times, and it was so painful to write it every single time I wrote it. And guess what? That car, I can't count how many times I washed it. I can't count all the things I did to take care of it. And I drove that car for, 15 years, I think, by the time I got rid of it. The difference was that I understood the value of that one. I understood the value of that one because that one hurt. That one hurt to have to write that check. That one hurt to have to know that that was my responsibility. I understood the value of it. Sometimes when we're given things, we don't understand the value, so we tend to squander them. I think that's what happened with the prodigal here. He didn't understand the value of his inheritance because it was something that he had been given. He didn't understand the work that had gone into putting back all this money. He didn't understand the blood, sweat, and tears that had gone into building this up because to him it was just a check that was handed to him. That didn't seem very hard, and he squandered it. How many times do we waste the things that have been given to us? Now, yours might not be a story of a possession. It might not be that you've squandered anything like that, but how often do we squander our talents, our gifts, our abilities? How often do we squander opportunities that God opens in front of us? Sometimes it might be in a job opportunity or whatever it might be. How often do we waste those things that have been given to us because we forget to attach the right value to what's been given? The story continues, and Jesus says, when he came to himself, don't you love that? When he came to himself, even if you waste everything, Jesus leaves the door open for an opportunity to come to yourself. He said, how many of my Father's hired hands have more than enough? Remember that, more than enough bread. But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my Father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Isn't it interesting when we squander something, when we waste, when we fail at something, how quickly we are ready to settle then for second best? The son says, I know my Father's house. I lived there. I know that I never wanted for anything. All my needs were met. Everything was taken care of. And I even know to the point that the servants had more than enough bread. They had everything they needed. So maybe if I go back and I say, you know what, I know I blew it. I know I can never be your son again. I can never get back to that level. But maybe I could just be your servant. And we hear him practicing his speech, right? He's practicing how he's going to say this because he thinks he's just completely blown it. But the reality is that wanting always follows wasting. He had wasted his inheritance, and now he's found in this place where he's going, maybe if I can just get back to the level of servant. Maybe if I can just get back to this place, then everything will be okay. He's ready to settle. Think about how often we do this. I used to be a youth pastor, so I worked with teenagers a lot. And I can't tell you how many conversations I had with teenagers where they would realize in some area of their life they had fallen short of the standard. And then their reaction was just to go, well, I guess I blew that. There's no sense even trying anymore. And it sounds silly to us because we've been through a little bit more life and we go, well, you're going to mess up. You kind of just have to get back up. But yet we do tend to settle. We say, I'm never going to be that anymore, but I'll just shoot for this. And we settle. That's what the prodigal son is doing. He's settling. But thankfully, the story isn't over there because it says he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. He ran, embraced, and kissed him. The son said to him, remember, he's been practicing this speech. He's ready. If I say this just right, maybe my dad will take me back, at least as a servant. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer to be worthy to be called your son. And he's just about to say, but maybe could you at least take me back as a servant? But the father doesn't even let him get there. He interrupts and he says, no, stop. Servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf, kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. They began to celebrate. The son comes back saying, I'll never be this, but maybe I can just be this. I'll never be your son again. I'm sorry, I blew that. I can never be your son again because I've wasted that opportunity. I've wasted what you've given to me. But maybe you'll just take me back as your servant. And the father, almost with a smirk on his face, says, what? No, just stop. Servants, go get the stuff. We're celebrating. My son is back. My son is back. I love the fact that he turns and talks to the servants and tells them, because in essence what he's saying is, servants, I want you to understand this. He will never be one of you. I love you. You're great. You're my servants. You work for me. That's wonderful. But he's my son. See, the difference is the father didn't see a waste. The son thought he was a waste. He thought he'd blown everything. He thought, everything had just gone out the window at this point. But the father didn't see a waste. He saw his son. He saw a reason to celebrate because the lost had come home. The lost had been found. So this continues the celebration of Luke 15. The celebration of what was lost is now found. The lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. But there's one character in this entire chapter who just didn't understand the program, didn't understand what was going on here. It tells us the story. Now his older son was in the field. I want you to notice that. His older son was in the field. What do you do in the field? You work. I've wondered before, what's he doing in the field? What kind of work? Whose work is he doing? I wonder if he's doing the prodigal's work since he left. Somebody had to pick up the slack that was left. When the prodigal fled and went to squander and blow everything, somebody had to pick up the slack. Now he's in the field, he's working, and I wonder if even as he's working, he's thinking about, that lousy brother of mine, that lazy kid. Here I am doing all the work. He's out living it up. He's in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. What's going on? And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat, that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.' And he said to him, 'Son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost, and now he's found.'" The language of the father is interesting here, because he says, "Son, I don't think you understand. You seem upset that your brother is back and we're celebrating, but I don't get that because you've been with me all along. And you know that everything I have is yours. If you wanted to throw a party, you could have just told me. You were right here. So I don't understand what's going on." But what the oldest had missed was he had missed an opportunity. Now let me tell you, there's a few things he missed here. He missed the opportunity, first of all, to just be with his father. I hadn't thought of this before I had read this week, but he missed the opportunity to have his father all to himself. Isn't that interesting? If you have children and you've started with one, well, obviously you've started with one. But when you add the second, there's a new dynamic, right? The first one gets all your attention. You're handling with kid gloves and trying to make sure they don't, kill themselves. But you're overly protective. The second one, you're a little less protective. By the third one, from what I hear, you're just happy if they don't kill themselves or someone else. But you think of the different dynamics even for those kids, what they're dealing with. That first child gets mom and dad all to themselves. They get all that attention. They get the opportunity that anytime they want your attention, they want to ask a question, they want to talk to you, they can, for the most part, they can have your undivided attention in that moment. Then child number 2 comes along and the attention gets a little more divided. And it's a little more challenging with that. The oldest son had an opportunity to have his father's undivided attention. The whole time the brother is away, the prodigal son is away, he has the opportunity to have his father all to himself. And what we see here is he must have blown that. He wasted that opportunity. He wasted that time that he had with his father. But the second thing, and I think the more troubling thing, is he wasted the opportunity to celebrate with his father. Speaking of celebration, he wasted the opportunity to celebrate with his father. You think about some of those times when you make the deepest connection with someone is when you get to experience a moment of just unbridled joy. You're in that moment of victory or whatever that is, and there's a bond. And I think about as a father, I have 2 daughters, a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I think my best days in life are when I get to see that look on their face like they've accomplished something or they're so excited about something, and that pure childlike joy that comes across their face. And that connection is not something that anyone else in the world could replace. There's such a depth to that. The oldest son, even though he's living in the same house as his father, he's working the same land. He's right there with him. He's in essence a partner in the business. He's right there. And yet he can't even recognize a moment where he gets to celebrate with his father. He gets to enter into that moment. The envy, the jealousy eats him up so much that he just can't even do that. I think even the difference in the language of the father and the oldest son is different. The oldest son in verse 30 refers to the prodigal as this son of yours. Now, parents, you recognize that, right? When your kids are being brats and, that son of yours, you need to take care of him. That's what the oldest is saying right there. This son of yours, he has essentially said, that's not my brother anymore. See, here's the deal, Dad. There's a circle, and he stepped outside of that circle. He's no longer my brother. He's your son. He's an outsider. He doesn't belong here anymore. He's an outsider. This son of yours. I love the father's response, because the father, and I can only imagine in this soothing, voice, comes back to him and refers to him as your brother, when your brother came back. And he's reminding him, son, listen, he's not an outsider. He's your brother. He's my son. He's one of us. We can't push him out. I think that language is so representative of what we have to be careful of in the church. Because it's very easy for us to become insiders and start looking at others as outsiders. It's very easy for us to start growing in our faith, and maybe it's even a very positive thing. We're working hard. We're working for the right goals and working for the right things. But all of a sudden, we start looking kind of sideways at people when they walk in the doors, and we go, what are they doing here? I mean, I work with them. I know the kind of things they talk about. I've been to family gatherings with them. What are they doing here? Careful. Careful. Because we have to remember the central purpose that Jesus talks about is the Son of Man. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. To seek and to save the lost. So far, Luke 15 has been a celebration of what is lost is now found. One character doesn't get it, and the ironic thing is the oldest son, being the one who is still physically in the place he belongs and still positioned in the place where he's supposed to be physically, he might be the most lost of any of the characters throughout this entire chapter. Because he has wasted the opportunity that's been right in front of him the whole time. And because he doesn't even realize he's lost. Doesn't realize he's wasted an opportunity. He's just lost. Father says, you've been with me. You're always with me. Now we celebrate because your brother is home. What's lost is now found. As we're closing, I think about a story. Yesterday, Jess and I were doing some cleanup. It was the day wasn't quite so hot and muggy to be outside and do some work, and so we had gone out. We were cleaning in our garage and doing some of that, and then I was actually over touching up some trim. And bright white paint that I'm touching up the trim around our front door with. And it's looking nice, and it outlines. We have a bright red front door. Ask my wife about it sometime. It's what sold her on the house was the red front door. But painting the white around there, it just makes offsets the red really nice. And as I'm painting, the girls are running, and they're wild, and they're crazy. They're just being kids. And my 4-year-old runs up, and before I can even say anything, and parents, you know how this is, 4 years old, she runs up before I even hardly know she's there. She's put her hand in the white paint and on the red door. Yeah. And my first reaction is, we've been working a long day up to this point, and I kind of snapped at her. I said, "Oh, Liv, what are you doing?" And I don't really shout. I mean, you can hear I'm not that loud of a guy, but for me, I shouted at her. And she turned and she started to go away, and I could tell, I'd hurt her feelings. And so 2 steps away, and I reached out and I grabbed her by the arm and I pulled her back in, and I said, "Honey, I'm sorry." I said, "I know it was an accident. It was a mistake. And Daddy's not mad at you, but please be careful around the white paint." And for all of us, we get that as parents. I mean, you know what? There have been times where I've reacted and I haven't thought to grab them, and I'll have to go, an hour later, a day later, and say, "You know what? I'm sorry. That I was out of line. You it's not okay for me to react like that." And that's kind of heartwarming. It makes us think about that. But yet, you know what would have been really annoying for me in that moment? Is if her older sister would have come in and said, "What right do you have to forgive her? What right do you have? That handprint really messed up that door. And I've been helping all day long, and now she messed up, and what right do you have?" It's kind of a silly story. But yet it's really a reflection of our relationship with our Heavenly Father and our earthly family that He's given us. Because oftentimes we want to stand back and we want to tell God who He should forgive and who He shouldn't, and why. And God's response is much what mine would have been. "This is none of your business. Go play." It's not your call. We got to be careful. We got to be careful that we don't become like the oldest son. And we don't start looking around us, and whether it's in church or whether it's in conversations, that we go, I don't know if I would want to mess with them. They're outside of this circle. I mean, we all have had choices, and they've made the wrong choices, so they're outside of this circle. We got to be careful. We got to be careful because the Bible tells us each of us will give an account of himself to God. Let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. Each of us will give an account. And I think that account will come back to that statement in Luke 19:10. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. And I think when we stand to give that account, they're going to have this list of, here's your life, and it's going to go, well, let's just put that aside, and let's just talk about this one thing. My mission, my reason for sending Jesus to earth was to seek and save the lost. Were you with me or were you against me? Were you with me or were you against me? I hope I'm not on the against me side. Because if that was Jesus' entire purpose of coming, then that's our entire purpose for being in this room today, is to seek and to save the lost. This story, the prodigal son, is one of those stories, because Jesus is speaking to such a diverse crowd, this story is one of those that speaks to everybody. You might be in this room and you might feel like the prodigal. You might feel like you've wasted it. You knew better, but the grass was greener. It seemed like there was a better opportunity on the other side. It seemed like, this just seemed like a good idea. I didn't think it was that big of a deal for me to go down this road. And you might feel like the prodigal, like you've wasted what's been given to you. Take heart, because the Father doesn't see a waste. He sees potential. And He sees a celebration of you coming back. But you might be in this room and you might feel like the oldest. you haven't tried to get this way. It's not like you're sitting here trying to find things wrong or anything like that, but yet there's a side that you feel like, I've done all of this. And in doing that, you've missed the point of an inheritance to begin with. You've missed the point of a relationship with your Heavenly Father to begin with, because He's not about what you can do for Him, because you can't really do anything for Him. And you've wasted your opportunity with Him. Be careful. Be careful that you don't find yourself on the wrong side of Jesus' mission. Be careful.